welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Kelsey. I'm the creator of Bite-Sized Ancient History and a recent graduate of Cambridge University. I hope you've all had a fantastic long bank holiday weekend and an amazing Easter for those of you that celebrate it. I don't know about you, but I have consumed basically my body weight in chocolate, and I hope if chocolate is your thing that you have done the same thing too, as is your right. Today we're going to be discussing the real Egyptology behind episode 3 of Moon Knight. And if you haven't been following this series and you're a fan of Moon Knight, where have you been? But don't worry, don't forget to like and subscribe, and then you won't miss out on my future videos. Now we're actually halfway through this series, which is really sad and really confusing because I feel like each episode we just have more questions rather than answers. But usually the good sign for a good series. If you're generally interested in Egyptology and other ancient historical content, don't forget to check out my other social media platforms. I'm just going to say now, massive spoiler warnings ahead if you haven't seen episode 3 yet. You may want to go back and watch that first and then come to this video a little bit later. But don't forget to save it so you don't forget. So without further ado, let's get into it. In episode 3, we start to focus a lot more on Layla and her background. We still don't have many answers, but we do know that she was somehow related to the concept of a black market within ancient Egyptian antiquities. While she debates whether she was actually fueling it or trying to help it sometimes, we know that she was involved. And this is a very real thing, so a big tick. Unfortunately, there is a huge black market for ancient Egyptian antiquities and other antiquities generally. So the US-based Antiquities Coalition has estimated the value of this black market to be around $3 billion. And this is just an estimate on the kind of idea of what they have that's out there. There's going to be a lot more which we still haven't accounted for. But as an interesting fact, this isn't a modern day phenomenon. It actually happened in ancient Egypt. You would have grave robbers during this ancient period. Some of them were even the priests that were in charge of the tomb and the embalming process. They would steal from their wealthy customers, or they would provide grave robbers with the information of where certain burials were so that they could access this wealth. And we know this because some of the tombs had remained completely sealed, but a lot of the wealthy goods had disappeared. Following this, in mainly the 20th century, we obviously have this idea of colonialism. And this is a fact that a lot of Westerners would go over to countries like Egypt, they would find treasures and then claim them as their own, which we now know by today's standard is something that you should and cannot do. But this creates a lot of issues for things that have been previously taken. Do they lay claim to it because they did it in a time where it was okay, or should they all be returned? Comment down below what you think. More recently, in 1970, UNESCO signed a deal to make sure that we were preventing the removal of cultural property as much as possible. The Protection of Antiquities law was then finally passed in 1983, making it illegal and therefore smuggling. And these laws were being passed because unfortunately Egypt has recently been going through a severe period of unrest. And this financial instability has encouraged a lot of locals to undertake these kinds of smuggling tasks. Some have even been exposed as working with inside the government to try and smuggle these goods. As time has progressed, things like social media has also allowed this smuggling culture to have a certain boom, with 50,000 Facebook members being part of groups where they were able to organise this smuggling. However, today the fines have been increased slowly over time so that you face a much harsher punishment, with jail time and fines between 50 to 500,000 Egyptian pounds. In this episode, Khonshu also talks about the fact that if the Egyptian gods turn against him or are upset with his actions, he will be imprisoned in stone. I'm really sad to say I've tried to find my best of any accounts that could be parallels to this, and I did not succeed, so I'm sorry, that's not so much a punishment. And at the end of the episode, obviously, spoiler, we do see him imprisoned in this mini statuette, which appears quite similar to my previous video with the EGYPTOLOGIST. While there's no record of the ancient Egyptian gods being imprisoned in stone, there is the concept that they could live within a statue. So, for example, with rituals like the daily ritual, which was performed thrice daily to the god in order to appease and nourish them, the ancient Egyptian priests would channel the god's spirit or ka into this statue so that they could receive the offerings. But it wasn't so much imprisoning them, but they do have the potential to embody these stone sculptures, so there's a little bit of truth. Again, with smaller amulets that we see where there's protective statuettes used by normal Egyptian citizens, if these were imbued with magic, or the ancient Egyptian word for it is heka, this would be done by a magic practitioner. They could embody the power once again of this Egyptian god and use their protection. To summon the other Egyptian gods, Khonshu uses an eclipse. And this is a quite epic scene within the episode, but is there any historical or mythological grounding to this? While we don't have any texts that relate the god Khonshu to a solar eclipse, we do have ancient Egyptian texts which we believe are referencing this event. The ancient Egyptians believed in the journey of a solar bark, and this would feature one god or many doing many daily battles in order to make sure that the sun rises and sets as they journey in the living realm and the realm of the deceased. One of the creatures, and the main creature they'd have to battle, is a snake called Apep. We then have records that describe when Apep has consumed the sun temporarily in this battle, and we believe that this is a reference to the solar eclipse. So, not specifically Khonshu, but it's a good side fact. With this action, Khonshu summons the ENNEAD. And if you hadn't seen my previous video, which I think was on episode 1, I talked briefly about this group, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. If you are interested in learning a little bit more, go check that video out. The group comprises of Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Set, Nephthys, and Isis. And we see this accurately depicted in the episode in this courtroom, which is apparently being held in the Great Pyramid of Giza. So, what's interesting is in this environment, we see them acting almost as a sort of tribunal or panel of judges. And this does have mythological backing, I'm very excited to tell you. So, if you know anything about Egyptian mythology, you've probably heard of the myth of Osiris. Osiris was the original Egyptian god king. However, he was murdered by his brother Set. He is then later avenged by his son Horus. And Horus in this has to compete with Set in a series of battles. In these battles, the ENNEAD act as the judges, and they reason in on who should actually be the king, if it should be Set or Horus. So that's really accurate, and I think that's a very cool niche detail. So as I briefly said, this courtroom is being held inside the Great Pyramids of Giza. And while I'd love to tell you that the pyramid within looks anything like the statues that they have of the gods, unfortunately it does not. But I think you're allowed a little bit of creative freedom when it comes to this, because the statues of the gods themselves are very accurate to how they are depicted, and I think that's really cool. The Great Pyramid of Giza is actually a resting place for one of the earliest kings called Khufu. Pyramids generally are the burials of the very rich pharaohs or elite. Within the pyramid is a section of subterranean chambers. However, these were not actually ever completed in this pyramid. This is where the body of Khufu would have lain. Instead, we see him a lot higher up in the king's chamber, and then there's also a queen's chamber. And then obviously a series of tunnels and kind of, not trapdoors, but false doors to potentially trick people, some believe. Others also think it's more of a cultural and spiritual meaning where their body and their soul can travel after their death. One of the main gods we talk to in this scene is the goddess Hathor, and she introduces herself as the goddess of music and love. And this is absolutely correct. While there may be other attributes as well, these are the main two that we often focus on. Specifically, she is often associated with an instrument called the sistrum, which is a kind of rattle. I'll just show you a picture because it's very hard to explain, but it was often used in festivals in ancient Egypt. These would be ritual festivals, and it would bring joy and delight to the goddess, alongside obviously being fun for the ancient Egyptians. She was often also titled the Mistress of Love, and there are many stories with her being associated with different male gods, one of them being Khonshu. So this is where we see this connection. After the failure of this courtroom scene, Hathor talks to Mark Spector and tells him about the Magi people. And these were very real, and this word or name may sound familiar if you've ever seen a film called The Mummy. At first, the term just refers to an ethnic group based in Nubia. However, from around the 18th dynasty, they actually act as a police force or guard of the royal burials. So it makes sense that she's sending him to this because he would have the information of where the different burials were. They eventually find the sarcophagus of the Magi named Senfu. And obviously, I think most of us will know what a sarcophagus is, and this is a very real thing, mostly used in more elite burials because the lower class workers probably wouldn't have been able to afford it. They would have had a much more simplistic burial with perhaps just wrappings or nothing at all. She describes how on the sarcophagus there is inscribed a description or a guide to the afterlife, and this is very accurate. So we see it in texts like the Book of the Dead, which would have been on scrolls accompanying the deceased, or we also see it in this case on the actual sarcophagus. So we see this with the book of two ways. They then also describe how there is stuff written and drawn on cartonnage. This is fine linen or papyrus covered with plaster to make it a little bit more durable, although I don't think quite as durable as we see in the episode. If that was happening in real life, there would be a massive source of anxiety for me because it would definitely be destroyed. On this cartonnage, there is a sort of coded map to take them to the burial place of Amit. And this idea of code in funeral rites and religious rites generally is pretty accurate. The priests use highly codified languages so that normal people could never even begin to attempt to understand these rituals and religious secrets. Not quite in the puzzle way that we see in the episode, but the idea is there. On the map is obviously a series of stars, and we're reminded by Steve that the sky we look at today does not look the same as what it would have looked like all those years ago. And this is very true. And astronomical dating is a massive thing in Egyptology. Albeit very complicated, it is very useful. So we can actually use astronomy to kind of date different historical events in ancient Egypt, because oftentimes when they're dating an event themselves, they will describe an astronomical event, or we can use that as a kind of baseline. But to do this, we need to work out what the stars would have looked like then. So a very long and complicated process, but very cool. And I think that is all we're going to have time for today. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye!